How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most cross-eyed podcast in the world. We are your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome back to another edition of the Worst to Best series. And as always, we usually have a guest on these episodes. And it's been a very long time since we had this particular guest on. And she's been on a few in the past, actually, but it's been a very long time since we had her on. So would you please welcome SLUG BAIT?
Woo!
What's up? What's up?
Welcome
it's been a while.
back. It's been way too long.
I have definitely not been on this podcast ever in my life. It's great to be here. I'm very glad because this is a band that's very close to my heart. Got into them when I was in high school, you know. They've been with me for, I'm talking about them like they're my fucking parents, but I really enjoy their music. So I'm really hyped to start this episode off. So it's gonna be a good episode, I can tell.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And we are, of course, talking about Creed.
Yes!
We were, of course, talking about Stained.
We are, of course, talking about Limp Bizkit.
Yeah.
Now, on a real note, though, we are talking about the one, the only Talking Heads.
Hell yeah.
Oh boy, this is very exciting. Talking Heads are one of my favorite bands, so this is going to be, it's going to be great to do this episode. I've been highly anticipating doing this for a long time now. So, without further ado, let's get started.
Hell yeah.
We have their 8 studio albums ranked. We're not going to be including the live albums, but they are some of the most essential live albums like out there. So obviously, I definitely recommend you give them a watch, especially Stop Making Sense.
Fucking
But,
amazing.
Yeah, exactly. And starting at the number 8 spot, in my opinion, Talking Heads' worst album is Naked.
I agree.
Yeah, yeah, I agree too. The Funny Monkey GIF album. It's
Yeah. Yeah. My least favorite Talking Heads album also happens to be their final album, the Funny Monkey album. Not controversial at all. You know, I truthfully, I don't want to shit on Naked like a lot of other people do, but if I'm being realistic here, Naked just doesn't really offer much as an entire album, and while it's not bad, as it goes on, it gets very monotonous, and it honestly has some of the lowest lows in Talking Heads' discography. You know, for positives, I actually do think that it's decently produced. I think that the band sort of dipped their toes into some interesting sounds, like some of the Latin music influences, while combining that with their primary funky sound. You know, I think some of David Byrne's lyrical ideas are interesting after a while of albums that kind of felt lackluster songwriting-wise. And there's a couple of pretty good songs at the beginning of the album, but after that, there just isn't much else to take away from it. For me, the album kind of devolves into this, like, boring mess that feels like Talking Heads were trying to recapture, like, the colourful personality and creativity that their old music had, but it just doesn't as a result. It just kind of feels way too tame, way too drawn out, devoid of that personality, and it's just very lackluster. It's also the album where you can like blatantly hear how fractured the band's chemistry is, since David Byrne was more or less running the creative show here, and it's not really working out for him, in my opinion, since tracks like The Facts of Life exist. No, it's honestly baffling how night and day the quality and the interest of their discography has been in comparison with this one. You know, it's a shame that they ended on a pretty bland and somewhat dodgy note, but you know, it's whatever. Yeah, I hate saying that because I love Talking Heads so much, but that's all I really have to say about Naked. It's pretty damn boring. It may have some good songs on the front end, but I wouldn't stay for the rest.
Yeah, Naked honestly is an album that, if this makes sense, I prefer in theory rather than in execution. Without giving too much away, I found the band's last 2 albums to be, you know, quite safe. They didn't really explore anything out there, anything, you know, near enough the level of experimentation of their earlier projects. And so, you know, at least Naked does try something new. The tropical salsa approach is definitely a new direction for the band. It's something that, you know, definitely had its potential, and that potential is briefly met on this album. But honestly, I think that this project really just lacks structure, lacks quality, and despite being interesting in a sense that it does try something new, I don't think it really accomplishes what it wants to. The songwriting here, the instrumentation, it just really fails to stand out. I definitely can and do respect this album for, trying something new, especially considering the band were met with very, very big success in the years prior to this, and could have easily just phoned it in again and played things safe. But the way that these new ideas and new sounds were incorporated into the band's dynamic just doesn't really work for me, and I also cannot convince myself that the band's performances on here instrumentally are anything remarkable, especially compared to a lot of their previous material.
Yeah, it's a strange album because on one hand, the first two songs, Blind and Mr. Jones, are like genuinely great and like underappreciated gems by the Talking Heads, with like the horns and brass and the colorful production, percussion, like the bongos and stuff, and the Donkey Kong adjacent drums at the start of Ruby Deer. Like that was like the first thing that came to my head, was it sounded like the theme to fucking Donkey Kong, like like Donkey Kong Country or something like that. But then you have shit like the Facts of Life. Like, what were they thinking?
Oh no!
Who thought that was a good idea? I mean, with all respect, Mr. Byrne, you're one of my heroes, but oh my god. Honestly. Overall, it's just an okay album. It's not terrible, but it's just not that good of a Talking Heads album. They've just done so much better in the past, and it's like you said before. It's a shame that they ended on like sort of a bland note. Also, I'm just gonna say it. Nothing But Flowers is just the new wave version of Fancy Like.
Oh, Jesus Christ, why did you say that?
I mean, Dairy Queen and Pizza Hut, and it's like an ad. I mean, I wish that's not like, I wish that it, I mean, I don't think it's as bad as Fancy Like, but it was the first thing that came to my head, and, yeah. But,
that's such a wild comparison I did not expect. But anyway. Yeah, my favourite tracks on Naked are Mr. Jones and Totally Nude. The worst track is Facts of Life.
My favourite tracks were Totally New and Nothing But Flowers. My least favourite tracks are The Facts of Life and Big Daddy.
My favourite songs were Blind, Mr. Jones, and Ruby Deer. And my least favourite songs were The Facts of Life, Sax and Violins, and Big Daddy. Yeah,
I still can't believe that's a real song by Talking Heads.
Both of us are now on tape.
It's a very questionable album. Like, if you think about it, just very bizarre lyrical content. I mean, it's just...
yeah, I mean, he wants us to return to Monkey, but I don't know.
But...
Yes, so moving on to our number 7 picks, I chose True Stories.
I also chose True Stories.
I also chose True Stories.
Oh my god.
Well, hey! How controversial indeed. Yeah, True Stories. An album that's actually tied to a cult film of the same name by David Byrne, and it's another one of those instances where the movie precedes the music. It's also another Talking Heads album that isn't too fondly remembered in the grander scheme of their discography, and it's very understandable why this is seen as one of the band's weakest albums. And I don't think it's a bad album by any means, but it's a hard one to stomach at times. True Stories is essentially Talking Heads at their, in my opinion, their weakest creatively, since this album just doesn't have much about it that's really Talking Heads sounding. Instead, it just sounds like your run-of-the-mill 80s new wave album. Like, if you put this on and had me listen to it without knowing it was Talking Heads, I genuinely would not have guessed that it was Talking Heads. It just seems like during these recordings, the creative juices weren't really flowing. Maybe they, wanted to make something more accessible with the movie in context, but either way, it just makes for some generally just kind of uninspired and disappointing material from them. Despite this, I wouldn't call True Stories a bad album. It's just an okay album all in all, with a much better second half than the first. Some of the shit that's on the first half is probably some of the worst that the band have ever made, honestly. It's so dated and annoying that it's grating, like Papa Legba, which is honestly like the worst Talking Heads song in my opinion. Second half carries this album for me. I actually really like the songs in the second half, but still, Talking Heads have done much better than the material on this album. I don't have much else to say besides that. It's an okay album that has a decent second half, but a very woeful first half. It's also the band at their least ambitious and creative, in my opinion.
True Stories and Naked for me are almost on par, to be honest. But the reason that while I respect Naked for trying to spice things up with the band sound, I do think that the final product is just better executed and better sounding on True Stories. Even though it's definitely the safer of the two albums. By the time this project was released, the band had already been well into their most commercially successful era, and the wildly successful Little Creatures and obviously Stop Making Sense, both propelled the band into just highs that no one could have ever imagined. But True Stories, while definitely not the first project to mark the band's decline, was definitely the project which I think most evidently zeroed in on just a very, very mainstream, accessible, and almost uncharacteristically safe sound for the Talking Heads. This project is just so of its time, it hurts. And honestly, there's just nothing interesting on here that would have, helped it age a little more gracefully. It just sounds like Mick said, countless other 80s pop rock album. It doesn't have that, exciting Talking Heads flair. It's clearly the band past their prime, and it's just a safe, uninteresting, inoffensive project.
Yeah, I mean, it's an okay album. It is pretty much a less consistent Little Creatures and a less fucking weird-ass version of Naked. I mean, for what it is, it's not terrible. It's just very inoffensive, like Nostalgia said. I do think a lot of filler could be cut out, such as the really strange Papa Legba, which is tied with The Facts of Life as my least favorite Talking Heads song. I mean, other than that, it's not bad. It's not great like other late era Heads songs or albums are. It's just I wouldn't call it mid, but it's like I said about Naked. It's not a bad album, but it's not a good Talking Heads album. Nothing else really. I've got much else to say. Give it a shot if you're interested in Post Creatures, Talking Heads, or don't. I don't control you.
Alright, my favourite tracks on True Stories are Wild Wild Life, Radiohead, and Dream Operator. Worst track is Papa Legba.
My least favorite... I'll start with my favourites. Not that negative. My favourite tracks were Wild Wild Life and People Like Us. My least favourite track, of course, was Papa Legba.
My favorite songs were Love for Sale, Puzzle and Evidence, Wild Wild Life, and Dream Operator, and my least favorite songs were Hey Now and Papa Legba.
Alright, we're going to move on to our number 6 picks, and I chose Little Creatures.
I also chose Little Creatures.
Oh man, it's here. I got Speaking in Tongues.
Oh.
Whoa.
Okay.
Holy damn. Oh, jeez.
Let's fly through this, Mick.
Sorry?
No, we'll leave it till last. It needs some suspense.
We need the suspense. Yeah. I am in shock. Wow.
I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We'll let you explain yourself. Anyways. Right. Yeah, Little Creatures. I won't sit here and pretend that Little Creatures is a bad record or anything, because it really isn't. It has its moments, but as a whole, Little Creatures just isn't all that impressive of an album to me, considering everything else that Talking Heads did before it. And at this point, it just comes off like the band were trying to water down their sound a little. It has some good tracks for sure, like And She Was, and of course Road to Nowhere. The latter being like the only real moment of brilliance in the album for me, and the production, while fairly dated, it's decent for what it is. It's listenable, but that's all it really is in this instance, since it just kind of feels way too bare bones and safe for a band that was as cutting edge and as ahead of their time as Talking Heads were. I mean, it just seems like the spark in the fire that made previous albums brilliant in terms of songwriting just doesn't really seem to be here, and that kind of just makes this album a bit bland in comparison. This is also like the first instance where David Byrne annoyed me on a track, and it was with the song "Stay Up Late." I don't know what the fuck he was doing on that track, but I did not like it in the slightest. I genuinely wish that I had more to say about it, but I honestly don't really have anything else to say about it. There just isn't really much else to take away aside from what I mentioned. Like, it's all in all, Little Creatures just feels like an insignificant moments for Talking Heads in a creative sense, and it also just seems like one of the most least interesting albums, in my opinion. It's not bad, it has its good tracks, but for what it's worth, it's alright but listenable pop rock.
Yeah, the band's most commercially successful studio album, Little Creatures, is also the first one to just not receive the level of universal critical praise each of its predecessors did. And for me, it's not at all difficult to see why this project is remembered quite indifferently amongst Talking Heads fans, especially when compared to the band's discography prior to its release. It really fails to excite and build upon the band's sound in any meaningful way. This album, I think, is best described as just new wave straight pop rock. It loses a lot of the band's, individualism and experimentation, and instead delivers just quite inoffensive earworms. Honestly, it's a really hard album to hate. There's nothing on here that would, immediately lead me to believe that the band had lost their mojo entirely, but it was evidently their safest record to date at the time, and that in turn definitely allowed it to thrive commercially. But I think for me personally, it definitely sacrificed a lot of its longevity. I will say it's certainly still very enjoyable and a far more interesting experience than the two previous albums we talked about, but for me it's still definitely kind of marked a decline in the band's quality.
Alright, so you might be wondering
now
you might be wondering why this is so low on my list, and that's because of this. I just think the sound on the album is a little too sparse for my taste. I mean, the drums don't sound the best at times, and there's a huge dip in quality in the middle of the album. Just my opinion, but with all that being said, songs like Burning Down the House, Girlfriend is Better, Slippery People, Making Flippy Floppy, Pull Up the Roots, which is a really, really underrated track in the Heads discography, and especially This Must Be the Place, are just friggin' fantastic, Also, it's got the best song that uses the term flippy floppy in the title, so I guess you gotta give them that.
There's some tight competition there.
Yeah. For sure.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Alright.
Short little review. Yep.
Alright. So, favorite tracks on Little Creatures are And She Was and Road to Nowhere. My least favorite track is Stay Up Late.
My favorite tracks on Little Creatures were And She Was, Creatures of Love, and Perfect World. My least favorite track is also Stay Up Late.
My favorite songs on Speaking in Tongues were Burning Down the House, Making Flippy Floppy, Girlfriend is Better, Slippery People, Pull Up the Roots, and This Must Be the Place. My least favorite songs are I Get Wild, Wild Gravity, and Swamp.
Alright, moving on to our number 5 picks, and I chose More Songs About Buildings and Food.
Ditto.
I chose Talking Head 77.
Alright.
Hi.
Alright, Songs About Buildings and Food is the band's sophomore album. It's another pretty beloved album in the band's discography, and in retrospect, this album sounds like Talking Heads were trying to improve upon the quality of what broke them through in the scene with their debut. But personally, I prefer a few more of the band's albums over it. Either way, I still think it's a really good album. Despite a few moments where the band tries some new things, for the most part, More Songs is very much like their debut. The band stick to their quirky, anxious, and funky brand of post-punk, but this time with a more kind of refined production quality that has more going on in contrast with the debut, all due to the mastermind himself, Brian Eno, who would work with them on 2 more albums. I don't think there's much you can really slate the band for when it comes to the production and instrumentation generally, since it's all really damn good for the most part. The grooves are still sounding really slick, the guitar work is really good. I do love the extra layers and sounds that Eno incorporates into the production, giving it a bit more of a beefy sound. Plus, there's some fantastic tracks in here, particularly the ones that are more energetic and infectious, like Found a Job and I'm Not in Love. But I suppose what kind of disconnects me from some of the tracks here is the lack of energy or much that's unique or interesting for the band, since they kind of already did it better on their debut, in my opinion. You know, these songs just aren't really being sold to me as anything new for them, apart from, say, like the dub-inspired Warning song, the band's cover of Al Green's Take Me to the River, and, you know, the Big Country, which is a cute little country number. David Byrne sounds pretty good all over this album too, although I personally don't get much from his lyrics on this album, but hey, I won't complain when Byrne is still delivering on some good performances. The great tracks in this thing are absolutely great. I think it's good overall, and while I don't think it totally breaks the formula from their debut, it's a moment where they were building towards even bigger and better things, which we did eventually get down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I went for the same album as you, and I agree with a lot of what you said. This project oftentimes gets a little overlooked, and while obviously it's still a very good release, I do somewhat understand why. It's just honestly overshadowed by some truly spectacular albums, and that's really the only reason. This project is through and through very enjoyable and has some absolute standout moments, but it's perhaps most notable for being the first of the 3 projects produced by the legendary Brian Eno. And while his impact is certainly evidently heard, I think that it's still the least outstanding collaboration between the two. More Songs About Buildings and Food is in a way a clear evolution from the sound of the band's debut. The energy is just more flamboyant, the music is just more rhythmically dense, and Eno really did wonders in tightening the band's dynamic and sound, especially when it comes to the rhythm section. And I think his impact just immediately stood out, and it was immediately clear that he was definitely a good fit for the band. But I think that that dynamic that I mentioned between Eno and the band was just expanded on and just taken to such high highs that this project just does kind of feel like a stepping stone, in my opinion. It kind of feels like it's stuck in the middle of 2 periods of greatness for the Talking Heads. As we'll get to their debut, but that's another project I'm very fond of. And I do think that the band and Eno aren't quite at their level of just virtuosity and synchronicity when it comes to their sound. It definitely feels like the two finding common ground and testing the waters when it comes to each other's energy, and it doesn't really feel like the two finding their true potential together. And in my opinion, it's just a little less sticky and memorable than their debut, and just not quite as spectacular as their following albums.
So, Talking Heads 77, it's a solid debut record. It's got a lot of bangers on it. Even though, to address the elephant in the room, Psycho Killer is miles above the rest of the album. Even though it is still a very good album, it just sticks out like a sore thumb in terms of quality and just memorability. Pulled Up is great. Tentative Decisions has this, I don't know, it's a weird song, but it's not weird. I think it's the groove that just, it's just a song that shouldn't slap as much as it does. Don't Worry About the Government sounds like the theme song to just a Wes Anderson movie that doesn't exist. It's the beginning. It's definitely the beginning. It just sounds like something that he would use in fucking Moonrise Kingdom or some shit. But no, it's just it's what am I trying to say? It's a very great record. It just doesn't hit as high as More Songs About Buildings and Food in terms of that sort of early post-punk sound. But I will say, Psycho Killer did introduce me to the band, so I gotta give him that. I found the band through Rock Band 2 because Psycho Killer was on it.
Ooh.
So I thought it's just funny to mention. No, but it's definitely impressive that most of the stuff was recorded in 76, around the time the Ramones were making waves in the DIY scene, I guess you could say, at the time. Just the early punk scene, which I thought was interesting. But overall, it's a pretty great record. It just doesn't, like you guys have said about More Songs, it doesn't hit as high as other records for me.
Fair enough.
Fair, yeah.
Yeah, my favorite tracks from More Songs About Buildings of Food are Thank You for Sending Me an Angel, Found a Job, and I'm Not in Love. My least favorite track is Stay Hungry.
My favorite tracks are I'm Not in Love, Stay Hungry, and Take Me to the River. My least favorite track is The Girl Want to Be with the Girls. The Girls Want to Be with the Girls.
My favorite songs off Talking Heads 77 are Uh-Oh, Love Comes to Town, New Feeling, Tentative Decisions, The Book I Read, Psycho Killer, and Pulled Up. And my least favorite song would probably have to be First Week, Last Week, Carefree.
Alright, we're in the second half of our lists now. And my number 4 pick is Talking Head 77.
Okay, phew. My number 4 pick is Fear of Music.
We finally broke the mold.
My number 4 pick is Little Creatures.
Ooh. Bit of diversity, let's go.
Yeah.
Finally. Let's go.
Finally. Yes, Talking Head 77. The band's debut album, and generally speaking, I think it's a great album that showcased a blueprint that Talking Heads continuously developed for many albums after, and it's an interesting moment for them when we take into account the time that it came out and where punk music was during this time as well. Even from the very beginning, Talking Heads were such a difficult band to narrow down into like a genre or a specific sound, because quite frankly, they were a really weird fucking band from the get-go, and describing them as just like new wave, post-punk or funk rock would still be doing them a disservice, because it's, especially on their debut, when we think about it, it's impressive that the band achieved this and made a sound that was just so unique and interesting for the 70s on their debut. And even with that out of context, I really like their debut. I think it's really fun and interesting. It's probably the rawest sounding Talking Heads album to me, since the production isn't as pristine or as dense as their later works, but that doesn't really bother me at all with repeated listens, since it sounds really good. Even if the sounds are a bit thin, it's balanced and mixed well. The band's instrumentation sounds good in this setting, and the simplicity at this point in their career gives way to some absolute bangers like the opening track, No Compassion, and of course the very iconic Psycho Killer, which is easily one of their best tracks still. Their debut also sets them apart from so many of their contemporaries, since they blend together so many elements that made them a unique band. Their sound contained funky grooves that were incredibly danceable. They had a punk energy to them while remaining incredibly catchy, and they had a frontman who stood out as someone who was truly unique, since David Byrne's manic and awkward vocal mannerisms made for some very interesting dynamics to like when you think about that whole scene. He's unique and a little psychotic at that. Every time I've listened to the debut, I've always come out of it thoroughly enjoying it, and there's plenty of fantastic tracks, some of which are some of the band's most notable and essential. There may be one or two songs that aren't so memorable in comparison, but there's a lot of tracks and performances that absolutely carry this record. The band had great ideas and personality from the beginning, but further down the road they would only go on to perfect that sound. And yeah, I really love Talking Head 77. There's just a couple more records that I prefer.
Speaking of albums that you really love, but there's just some records you prefer, I went with Fear of Music, which was a fantastic project, and it feels just odd having this kind of at the midpoint of the rankings, but it is what it is. I think Fear of Music was the album where the synergy between the band and Brian Eno really started to develop into just something special and something truly timeless. Obviously, given my rankings, I don't believe it's quite the culmination of what the band would accomplish with Eno, but it was certainly a leap in the right direction, and it wasn't a step, it was a leap in the right direction. The talking heads we get on Fear of Music are just absolutely free, absolutely uncaged, willing to incorporate any sound and influence they feel like into their sound, and each idea, each influence is just incorporated just with such grace and just prowess that it's really quite spectacular. There's influences here from Afrobeat, disco, just world music in general. And they're all over this project, and they're just so hard to pinpoint because they're pretty much endless. All the performances on here are just absolutely wild. Every single member of the band just puts blood, sweat and tears into maintaining an electrifying energy throughout. And the result is an album that, I'd call exactly that, electrifying. Why is it only fourth, you may ask? There's two reasons for me. Firstly, there are 3 cuts on here that I don't really care for. The track Animals, Electric Guitar, and Drugs. Admittedly, the only track I don't like is the latter, but, they still really don't do much for me and kind of just slow down the pace of the album. And secondly, I just really feel like this project lives in the shadow of, obviously, one certain album. a certain album that kind of does everything it does, but somehow even better. But I'll get to that later. But I also just have no reason to end on a negative note, so I will say that this album is just completely filled to the brim with just fantastic tracks. Cities, Izimbra, Heaven are just absolute gems, and Life During Wartime, depending on when you ask me, is possibly my favorite Talking Heads track, but it's definitely top 3. It's a 3-way race for me when it comes to best Talking Head tracks, but that's in there.
So Little Creatures, underrated, man. It's so underrated. I think it's the last great Talking Heads album. You got songs like And She Was, Creatures of Love, and especially Road to Nowhere, which is the best song post Speaking in Tongues. And also one that my psychology teacher in high school used in a PowerPoint about, I think it was generativity versus stagnation, which makes sense, I guess. Shout out to Coach Knowles, Know the Consequence. He's an OG. They're certified hood classics. It's a very strictly new wave sound, which a lot of people are turned off by because they usually prefer their Talking Heads with a little funk, a little post-punk, and that's okay. I personally still enjoy Little Creatures quite a bit. It's just I think it's not talked about enough. No pun intended. And that's all I really have to say about that record. So, yeah.
Alright, my favorite tracks on Talking Heads 77 is Uh-Oh, Love Comes to Town, No Compassion, and Psycho Killer. My least favorite track is Who Is It?
My favorite tracks on Fear of Music are Cities, Life During Wartime, and Heaven. And my least favorite track is Drugs.
I love drugs.
My favorite songs... My favorite songs from Little Creatures are And She Was, Creatures of Love, The Lady Don't Mind, Perfect World, and Road to Nowhere. And my least favorite song would probably be Walk It Down. So,
Right, we're moving on to the top 3 now.
Top 3, baby!
And I have been absolutely fucking stuck with these next 2 placements because I keep switching on them all the time. But it'll probably be a moment where it's like, on this day I'll prefer this album. But anyways, here we go. On my number 3 pick, I chose Fear of Music.
My number 3 pick is Talking Heads 77.
Here we go. My number 3 pick is Remain in Light.
Whoa. You came here with vengeance.
May woke up today and chose violence. Anyways, for the longest time, the only Talking Heads album that I'd ever actually heard was Remain in Light, which we will get to. But then I remember I was doing my classic albums binge, and the next one that was coming up on my list at the time was, in fact, Fear of Music. And there's definitely a reason why this is a classic, because, simply put, it's another fucking incredible album from Talking Heads. You know, their second album with Brian, only saw the band, get better and better with what they were trying to do, and while his presence on this album, his presence on the album that came before this one was noticeable, you can hear his influence and his general synergy with the band affecting the ideas and the confidence on this album into a whole new level, with the band opting to get more ambitious and just more dynamic sounding. They move into more atmospheric and dense areas all over this album, while also finding a good balance between the band's sound that they broke through with and the more ambitious ventures and ideas. This album is still very funk and punk influenced. There's plenty of danceable grooves, there's plenty of pop sensibility. It still has that weird charm that we get from David Byrne's performances, except this time he sounds more assured of his presence and his lyrics, which are very interesting to read into. the band began to show influences from African music as well on the opening song, and there are a few moments that border on being a bit industrial in my opinion. But what sells the album is just the sheer quality of the production, the performances, which are just nothing short of brilliant, and they translate into some amazing songs. You know, the best part about it is just how consistently brilliant it is. The songs in this thing are just incredible, and some of them rank among some of my favourite Talking Heads songs, including Paper, Cities, Memories Can't Wait, Heaven, and especially Life During Wartime, which is one of the catchiest and funnest songs Talking Heads has ever made. And it's a similar situation to you, Nostalgia. Like, ask me on one day, I will say this is my favorite Talking Heads song. But it kind of intertwines. Also, Animals is probably like the most unhinged David Byrne has ever sounded on the song before. The other members of the band do fantastic. They truly drive a lot of the ideas forward and make for some just incredible moments, and it just gets even better when we think about how infectious the grooves are and how interesting the sounds are they incorporate. Excuse me. So yeah, I would say more about this album, but I well and truly don't have much else to say because I'm running out of things to say. But all in all, it's an amazing album. It's one of my favorite Talking Heads albums. It's just a consistently interesting and infectious album that has great production, great songwriting, great ideas, and just consistently great songs. It's one of my favorite Talking Heads albums ever. I repeat myself there, but whatever. And yeah, it's easily one of the band's best, in my opinion.
Alright, so Remain in Light, this album and I go way back. I had first seriously gotten into music, because, I mean, growing up, you always get into... I feel like everybody always gets into classic rock first. Every, like, music geek, they get into, like, you know, AC/DC and Metallica and, like, stuff like that, which, not to diss on Metallica. Metallica's great. AC/DC not so much. But you end up, you start with the classics first. And as much as I disagree with them now, what seriously got me into music wasn't actually Rate Your Music or Album of the Year. It was the Rolling Stones Top 500 Albums of All Time list, which I discovered in, I want to say, I was like 14 at the time. And I'm 22 now, so obviously my taste has definitely evolved. But I first found out about, this was like the highest ranked Talking Heads album out of like the 3 or 4 albums that they included in the entire 500. So I put this album on, and once that fucking synth freak out from Born Under Punches kicked in, my mind, it was like somebody kicked the metaphorical door open in my fucking 9th grade head. It showed me what music could be. Music can be noisy, it can be abrasive, it can be just weird, and that's what makes David Byrne. I'm kind of getting a little sidetracked here, but that kind of makes David Byrne one of my favorite just people in music ever. He's unabashedly weird, quirky, out there, but that's what makes him great. And everybody knows, you know, Once in a Lifetime, one of the songs of all time, one of the best songs of all time too. It's absolutely fantastic. Just that entire first side is incredible. The only reason it's not in top 2 is because just the back half doesn't hold up to me, to the front end's greatness. As much Houses in Motion and Seen and Not Seen are good, but Listening Wind and The Overload don't really do it for me. I mean, there are days where I'm like, oh, I appreciate this more than other days. And then some days I'm like, wow, I can't wait for these songs to be over. Which is unfortunate because, I mean, considering the absolutely legendary status of this album. But, like I said before, it would be much higher if the last half just hit a little harder, you know? So, and that's all I really have to say about Remain in Light. So.
Fair enough.
Right.
You didn't go.
MickyT? I did. What?
You sure?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, am I tripping?
Oh, wait. No, I didn't.
See?
Wait, the order switch.
Wait, what?
Oh, I didn't even realize the order switch.
Oh, shoot. I'm sorry.
I'm not crazy. I'm
sorry.
No, I didn't even realize.
Get fucked, idiot.
Mick's keeping the show on the fucking rails here. Right. Yeah, my number 3 pick was Talking Heads 77, the band's debut. And it really didn't take long for the Talking Heads to just hit the ground running. And, despite only being the band's debut, Talking Heads 77 is still one of the band's finest and most memorable endeavors. The project sees the band burst onto the scene with a new wave sound, which was just completely their own. And, they also incorporated some very interesting art punk and post-punk elements into their sound. And as you both said, during an era when punk was still kind of in its formative years, the juxtaposition, and also the juxtaposition between just the anxiety and quirkiness in David Byrne's vocals and the band's just playful, punky, yet very rhythmically complex sound. Well, not complex, rhythmically dense sound. Just played out perfectly, in my opinion. This album is just on point rhythmically, melodically. Just the quality of this album is just through the roof and just so interesting from start to finish for a band that was, only making their debut. And since it's true that the band would go on to build upon the sound of this project, it in turn is in their most complex album. It's definitely dense and still full of just interesting and fantastically executed ideas, but when looking at the grander scheme of the band's discography, it definitely does sound a little primitive. But you know what, it's just so sticky, just so catchy. The instrumentals and the hooks all over this thing are just iconic. Tracks like New Feeling and of course the just larger than life Psycho Killer just can definitely drive up the quality of this album a bunch. They definitely, this is a project that definitely just gets ingrained in your psyche. It's so catchy, it's just, once you listen to it, it'll stay with you for days. And as far as consistency goes, this project also is very high up there. The only track on here that I really don't care for is Happy Day, which for me admittedly does get a little tired and predictable too quick. But overall, despite it only being the beginning of the Talking Heads journey, it's quite the statement, and it definitely set a foundation for one of the most exciting and influential bands of all time. So there's really no reason to hate this project.
Alright, my favourite tracks on Fear of Music are Cities, Life During Wartime, and Heaven. My least favourite track is Electric Guitar.
Maybe you can go first. I don't know.
So I'm sorry about that. Okay, so my favorite songs from Remain in Light were Born Under Punches, Cross-Eyed and Painless, The Great Curve, Once in a Lifetime, and Seen and Not Seen. And my least favorite song would probably be Listening Wind.
My favorite tracks on the band's debut were New Feeling, Psycho Killer, and Pulled Up, and my least favorite track was Happy Day.
Right, now we're moving on to the top 2 in our lists. And for me, my number 2 pick is Speaking in Tongues.
I agree, Mick.
My number 2 pick is More Songs About Buildings and Food.
Nice.
Oh, yeah.
So, Speaking in Tongues came out right after Remain in Light, and it kicked off the post-Eno era of the band's career, which I usually refer to as their pure 80s era, and I call it that because a lot of the band's projects after that show some sounds of production that feel particularly dated to that area, but that's not a completely bad thing at all, since even then Talking Heads still pulled through with some great songs in the few albums that followed, and Speaking in Tongues generally is just another amazing album from Talking Heads that easily goes down as one of their best, and it's one of my absolute favourites from them. For me, Speaking in Tongues is a welcome to drawback from the experimentation and ambition of their previous records, and in turn the band just hand us one of their most consistently infectious and catchy albums ever. And this is easily the funkiest and the grooviest album that Talking Heads ever made, and it fucking slaps from front to back. Holy fuck, there's so many good songs in this album. The production, while sure, it may feel of its time, to me, it doesn't really hold back these songs at all. And, seeing how refined and how great the mixing all over this thing is, it only adds further to the songs for me. The instrumentation is just as tight and as slick as you'd expect some of the band's best grooves and rhythms are to be. There's so many fun ones. There's so many amazing, fun and colourful synth leads all over this thing. And the hooks in this album are just so infectious. David Byrne sounds incredible on this album. This has got easily some of his best vocals. It also just seems like the band's clarity and creative vision on this album was just confident all over the board, since every song just feels so complete and colourful. They just really it seemed like such a blast to record, honestly, and it shows given how fantastic the songs are. I absolutely love Burning Down the House. The version on Stop Making Sense is leagues better, but it's still an incredible song. Girlfriend is Better is such a banger. It has some of the best production on any Talking Heads song, in my opinion. I love Slippery People. Swamp is a banger, and it's one of the most unique sounding Talking Head songs ever made, in my opinion. Moon Rocks is underrated as hell, and of course, the iconic This Must Be the Place is a perfect song. That song is, it's perfect. No more needs to be said. I love it to bits.
It's interesting, actually, because I think I read somewhere that they all switched instruments for that song.
Oh, shit.
Wait.
Yeah.
That's actually interesting.
I think Tina was on guitar, Chris was on like keyboards or something like that. But I heard that they all switched instruments, which is like really interesting.
That's actually
keyboard
sick.
in that track is fucking insane. So.
It actually is, honestly.
Please.
Oh my!
Oh, that's sick.
It actually is. That is insane. But yeah, just to finish off, this album is such a treat to listen to from front to back. It may come off as one of the more simple Talking Heads albums, but I think it's a nuanced album if you're really listening. And either way, it's just so fun. It's one of the funnest and catchiest albums Talking Heads have ever made. And it's honestly one of the catchiest albums to create ever, in my opinion. I fucking love this album. All in all, it's great. I fucking love it. It's growing on me more and more with each listen. And I think I know what the next Talking Heads album I'll be buying on vinyl is.
Oh,
Ooh.
I may be there with you. But yeah, I went with the same project as Mick, and man, this project I did not expect to like it this much. Same. I did have some, in preparation for this binge. I hadn't heard this project before. This was my first time hearing it, and seeing the impact that Eno had in the band, I was really kind of a little bit anxious to see what the band would do once they were free and on their own. And obviously I was aware of the closing track, This Must Be the Place, and that I just like Mick said, that track is just perfect. So I wasn't entirely worried, but still I was definitely curious to see what the band would do. And yeah, this project just blew me away when I first heard it. Released after a short hiatus the band took following the release of Remain in Light, and being again the first project without Eno, this was definitely a significant moment in the band's career. Definitely a shift in a lot of senses. And Eno, as I said, had been such a quintessential part of the band's evolution and growth in the decade prior, that going back to not having him around in the studio was always going to be a difference maker, whether it be for better or worse. It was just gonna be a difference maker. However, I think on this project they definitely took the experience and maturity that they definitely gained as a band from working with Eno, and took that and at the same time just made music by their own terms, undeniably. This project, I think, is best described as just incredibly hypnotic in the most catchy way possible. It mixes funky with abstract and is just an undeniable classic and masterpiece from start to finish. The band, just for me, doesn't lose their footing one bit. It feels like during the hiatus they kind of spent their time, letting the ideas brew and develop in their minds. And then when they finally re-entered the studio, it was with a vengeance. The music on Speaking in Tongues just hones in on the very ever-present funk aspects to their sounds, and it's an album that is at the same time a little less manic and unconventional than their previous projects, but what it does is just so unlike anything the band had done previously, and unlike a lot of even though it is very of its time, it still doesn't quite sound like anything else that was released in the 80s. It just, the essence of Talking Heads flows through this project, and it's just an absolute treat from start to finish. It never once diminishes in energy and quality. The highlights on here are just out of this world, making Making Flippy Floppy is just like a fun overdose. Girlfriend is Better is just straight groovy brilliance. Moon Rocks is one of the most underrated tracks in the band's discography. It feels like just the most infectious and delightful fever trip of all time. And This Must Be the Place. It's just nothing short of absolute genius, and it's one of the band's most gorgeous and breathtaking moments. Yeah, I think this album is an absolute classic, and it's an incredible achievement.
So, More Songs About Buildings and Food, easily, to me, their best strictly post-punk album. It takes the sound explored, their unique take on the ever-evolving sound of punk in the mid to late 80s and turns it up to 11. The drums are punchier than they were on 77. The guitars are crisper. Bass is groovier. And David's vocals are quirky as ever. But I'm Not in Love. I think it's a fantastic song. I think it might be top 3 for me, actually. Thank You for Sending Me an Angel is a perfect opening. Found a Job goes hard. The Big Country, like, I've recently come around to liking country music, like old 70s country rock, like Willie Nelson and shit like that. And it's just like a warm hug to me. The Big Country is like it's happy. It just gives off good vibes. And of course, the centerpiece, Take Me to the River. It might be my favorite Al Green cover ever. Maybe. Hard to tell, but it's just a fantastic start to Eno's inclusion, and not necessarily inclusion, but just him starting the three project run. It's a fantastic start to his influence in the band, and I love this album. I probably up there with Remain in Light as my one of the albums that I'm most nostalgic for by the Talking Heads. But yeah, I think it's a friggin' fantastic album. It's definitely one of my favorite post-punk albums of all time. So that's all I got to say about that.
Hell yeah.
Fair enough. And my favorite tracks on Speaking in Tongues, well, are all of them. But if I had to pick some, I'd say Burning Down the House, Girlfriend is Better, and This Must Be the Place.
My favorite tracks are Making Flippy Floppy, Moon Rocks, and This Must Be the Place. And my least favorite track is Swamp.
Oh, come on, Swamp is fun.
It's grand.
Hi.
Compared to everything else, it's a bit of an outlier.
Well, you stink.
My favorite songs from More Songs About Buildings and Food are Thank You for Sending Me an Angel, With Our Love, Warning Sign, Found a Job, I'm Not in Love, especially Take Me to the River, and The Big Country. And if I had to pick a least favorite song, I'd probably pick Artists Only.
And we're on to our number 1 picks. And
right.
And it's slightly controversial. I chose Remain in Light.
I agree.
I chose Back from the Dead 2 by Chief Keef.
Whoa, that's out there.
All right, I actually picked Fear of Music. It's my all-time favorite.
All right. Here we go. Ever since I first heard Remain in Light, I was just completely blown away by it. And to this day, I am still blown away by what David Byrne and company presented on here. You know, they once again worked with Brian Eno, and when you look into the way that this album was produced and put together, it just makes this album all the more impressive. As they were just ahead of their time with what they were trying to do here with the studio techniques. You know, this album's recording sessions were basically just jam sessions, but Brian Eno and David Byrne took snippets, licks, and grooves all over these sessions and arranged them into like longer compositions and songs, which at the time was practically unheard of. And when you actually listen to the songs here and how they flow, they were arranged and put together perfectly and smoothly. The fact that the loops were put together to create this like infectious, rhythmic, and just insane like set of licks is just it's in a cohesive way is incredible. It's beyond impressive. And sure, we can just gush over like how this album was recorded and how unique it was, but does that translate to the music being incredible? It translates to the music being perfect, in my opinion. This is one of my favorite albums of all time, and I absolutely adore it. The instrumentation on Remain in Light, for lack of better words, is fucking phenomenal. Nearly every single song on Remain in Light is so tightly performed, infectious in every way, an absolute blast to listen to. Even 40 years after its release, it does not sound like it comes from our planet. It's still incredibly alien and futuristic to this day. David Byrne's presence, lyricism, and vocal performances on this album are incredible, to say the least. His performances on here feel just so manic and unhinged in that David Byrne fashion. He still provides some incredibly catchy hooks throughout this album, but I love when he goes a little bit more understated and calm towards the latter half of the album. Topically, Byrne touches on a lot of things here. He's often very cryptic and it's very abstract in a few cases, but a lot of the topical focus is narrowed down to just so much stuff like government oppression, eroticism, insecurities over one's appearance, living day by day without like pondering or questioning existence as a whole. It's very interesting in lyricism, to be fair, and you gotta give him credit for that. His lyricism and spoken word ramblings are just so intriguing. They're written very well, and on first listens they definitely flew over my head, but damn, they're interesting to read into. When it comes to the actual songs on Remain in Light, I absolutely adore every single one. They're all just so dense, hypnotic, and just way too groovy not to enjoy. Like, the whole first half of that album, it gives me chills every single time because of how fucking, infectious, energetic, and amazing it is. Not to mention, I love the way this album flows from track to track. It just starts off very energetic and intense, and it just kind of slowly builds down into this, very slow and dreary finish, which I really love. Born Under Punches is one of the best album openers of all time. I love Cross-Eyed and Painless, and The Great Curve. The Great Curve especially is like top 2 Talking Heads song for me, to be honest. Once in a Lifetime is incredibly iconic, and for a good reason. It's easily one of the most euphoric, dense, and catchy tracks that Talking Heads have ever made. I love the more subdued nature to the track House in Motion. I love Seen and Not Seen, and I just love everything about this album. The final 2 tracks are very slow in comparison, but with the rest of the album, but they're so dense and dark. I love them, especially The Overload, which was actually inspired by Joy Division. Also, just to mention, Tina Weymouth is one of the most underrated bassists of all time. She is incredible, to say the least. Some of the shit that she does on here is so simple but so catchy and infectious. It's insane. And just generally, I think she doesn't get enough love as a bassist. And all in all, I absolutely love Remain in Light. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. I still fondly remember listening to it for the first time in college. I remember Louis got me to listen to it.
Oh my god, yeah, that was someday.
It was someday, but man, it's still stuck with me since. And here we are now. It's still my favorite Talking Heads album. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. And yeah.
Man, I mean, where can I start? This is also one of my favorite albums of all time, and sometimes it's fun being a contrarian, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It would just be, I wouldn't be true to myself. This project is just, it's just so perfect in every sense of the word for me, and I mean, there's absolutely no flaw that I can find in it, to be honest. It's one of those projects that just every time I listen through it, it just blows me away like the first time I heard it. From the first moment to the last, this album is just musical genius. It's an experience that is just so incredibly influential to music at large for decades to come. And at the same time, it's an album that, no matter how influential it is, it will never be replicated. It's just in my opinion, one of the greatest achievements in music history, and it's aged like fine wine. The fact that 42 years later, this album still sounds forward thinking. It still sounds meticulous. It's just as good as the day it was released. The Talking Heads partnership with Brian Eno on production duties, was always bound to culminate in something truly, truly special, and this is exactly that. I think Remain in Light for me expands on what the band did on Fear of Music in terms of just genre blending, experimentation, and just stretches that just to its absolute horizons. The influences are abundant and endless, yet, you know, this project just kind of transcends all of them. It becomes its own truly unique entity. Instrumentally, this thing is just so absolutely perfect. Every note, every bass line, every drum pattern, everything is just in the exact right place. And, you know, what baffles me most is how, despite this just almost robotic, almost inhuman, you know, instrumental precision, the album loses absolutely no flair, no energy, no vibrancy. It still feels so human through and through. It's just the music on here just feels alive. The delivery is just perfect from David Byrne as well. It's just the funkiest that the ramblings of a madman have ever sounded. For me, it really is one of those albums. It's, for me, easily the best Talking Heads album, and it's, again, one of the greatest albums ever released. I just cannot even come up with a single low point or flaw in here. It's just, it's one of those albums.
Before I get to my pick, somebody once told me that Seen and Not Seen is like the cisgender version of face shopping. How do you guys feel about that?
It's something.
Yeah.
That's a take.
But anyways, sorry, go on.
No, it's stage is yours.
Alright. So
I missed what you said, sorry?
I said, Seen and Not Seen is like the cisgender version of face shopping.
Wait, what? What? I'm confused.
It's like the whole lyric. Yeah, never mind.
I don't think Mick's familiar with face shopping.
The Sophie song.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never listened to Sophie.
What? Oh my god, you gotta change that. You've gotta change that.
I will.
Shouts out to Sophie, R.I.P.
Yeah, R.I.P.
I'm doing a little heart thing with my hands.
Same.
I'm still
with your index and thumb, yeah.
Yeah.
BTS.
No.
I will make sure to listen to Sophie. Trust.
Good. So, anyways, Fear of Music. It's my favorite Talking Heads song. I really didn't want to be contrarian. I really wanted to put Remain in Line in here, but this album is just, it means so much to me because, I mean, I got into it a little late in my high school years, but it's still my all-time favorite for Talking Heads. It's like being dropped, the best way I can describe it is it's like being dropped into like a barbed wire, just industrial, like dystopian jungle without a fucking parachute. It's just the perfect blend of their post-punk and new wave sounds. I mean, nothing has ever sounded like this album, and I don't think nothing ever will. Drugs is, I think it's underrated because of how fucking, it sounds like it's about to fucking fall apart at the seams. Like, it's just so, it's an anxious album for an already anxious sound. Memories Can't Wait, just unbelievably hard. Heaven is an absolutely gorgeous song. Just the heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. I mean, you can't help but like not sing to it. It's such a, oh my god. Mind, Cities, Izumbra, they made jumbled fucking a nonsense poem written by like, I think the lyrics, I think Izumbra was a poem written by this, it was a poet, but it was a sound poem, which means they don't use real words, like no English words. It's just like made up sounds, and that's the lyrics. They made fucking nonsense go hard. Literally incredible. And of course, nobody can talk about Fear of Music without mentioning Life During Wartime. Fucking anxiety inducing as hell, but fucking amazing song. I mean,
fun ass anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. But no, it's an amazing album. Like, I've probably listened to this just as much as Remain in Light or more songs about buildings and food. It's just wow. I mean, it just blows me away every time I listen to it. Might be a perfect album for me. It might be my next 100, honestly. Which, I mean, it might be a bit of a hot take, maybe, I don't know, but it's just wow, it's incredible. So
I
that's
mean,
all.
it's a 9 for me. It's a 9 for me.
Yeah, people love the album. I don't think it's that.
All right.
That's
Yeah.
spicy.
So that's all I gotta say.
All right.
Yeah.
And my favorite tracks on Remain in Light, well, are all of them, but if I had to pick some personal favorites, it would be Born Under Punches, The Great Curve, and Once in a Lifetime.
My favorite are Born Under Punches, Cross-Eyed and Painless, and Once in a Lifetime. No least favorites.
My favorites off Fear of Music are Izimbra, Mind, Paper, which, funny enough, is also a song title from Back from the Dead 2. Cities, Memories Can't Wait, Life During Wartime, Air, Heaven, and Drugs. And if I had to pick, if somebody held a gun up to my head and told me, you gotta, like, hate this song for whatever fucking bizarre reason, I would probably pick Electric Guitar. It's good, but it doesn't hit as hard as the other songs, so... Yep.
Fairs. And with that in mind, that is the end of our Talking Heads Worst to Best. We did it.
We did it.
It was a long time coming.
It was a long time coming, but that was absolutely worth
I'm
it.
putting my hand up to the screen and pretending like I'm high-fiving both of you. So
I'm high-fiving as well, trust.
there we go.
Punch the mic.
Alright, so...
Yeah, and we
really good.
Yeah, it was.
That Jacksepticeye.
That
Bro fist?
No.
There's my daily moment of cringe for the weekend.
No. May, thank you so much for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure to have you back on again.
Absolutely, hell yeah. And I am looking forward to any other future episodes that I'll be on, which I hope is soon. So
we'll definitely let you know.
Oh yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, with that in mind, thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. We really hope that you enjoyed. Let us know what some of your rankings are and what some of your favorite Talking Heads albums are. We definitely love to hear that. Of course, if you want to check out some of May's socials, she releases music under the name SLUG BAIT, and recently she dropped an album with Eli at *4 under the name NARKOSIS called Faculties of the Skull, which you should definitely give a listen to. It's a very great album.
Thank you.
And do you have anything else you want to plug?
No. I'll have my Spotify for SLUG BAIT and NARKOSIS in the description. Maybe the Insta. That's about it.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and of course, as always, check out our socials as well. Check out our album of the year and rate your music pages. Of course, be sure to join the Discord, and of course, if you want to support us, you can check out the Patreon as well. And yeah, with that in mind, my name is MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
And I'm SLUG BAIT.
See ya.
Peace.
Later.